Hey, thank you, Chris. Awesome. Thanks so much for having me. So pleasure to be here to talk to you about the book that I just published, Blockchain and the New Architecture of Trust. The starting point is that we are today living through a global crisis of trust. Trust in companies, trust in governments, trust in the media, by many measures, have been plummeting. The Edelman Group does an annual trust survey of people all around the world that they release at the World Economic Forum in Davos. And as you see, in 2019, their finding was that only 1 in 5 people, 20% of people, believe that the system is working for them. And they found that the gap in trust between the elites and the mass population was the highest they've ever seen. And I don't need to tell you this. In fact, you might not be surprised to know there are even some people who don't trust large Silicon Valley tech platforms anymore. This is the world that we live in today. So the question is, what's the answer? Well, you probably know I'm going to tell you. The answer is blockchain, right? Got a problem with fake news? Blockchain. Got a problem with insecure voting systems? Put it on the blockchain. Finance industry too concentrated? Well, we'll just blow it all up with blockchain. Now, about 1.5 years ago, when I was writing this book, and we were in the midst of the Bitcoin and cryptocurrency bubble, there were a lot more people speaking in these kind of hype-laden terms, saying, okay, blockchain is the solution, whatever the problem is. Now, with the subsequent cryptocurrency crash and the fact that many of these predictions have not materialized as fast as people thought, now there's a great deal of skepticism. I run into many more people saying, is this real at all? Was this all just hype? Is there anything that blockchain is useful for? And so what I want to talk to you about is getting beyond the hype, beyond the sort of wild promises that suddenly the world is going to be transformed because we have this technology, but also appreciating what the real value proposition is. I worked 20-odd years ago at the Federal Communications Commission on internet policy back in the 1990s. And back then, there were a tiny number of people on the internet, all dial-up over the phone network, almost all in the United States. And yet those of us who were online then, those of us who were engaged in figuring out the legal and regulatory issues, were totally convinced that the internet was going to change the world. And yes, we all got ahead of ourselves in the hype and excitement. We had a dot-com bubble back at that time. But the reality is the internet did change the world. It was true that this was a fundamental technology advance that today, of course, has swept all around the world. And blockchain gets me excited because it's the first basic technological change that I've seen since then that has the potential to have a similar kind of impact. Now, I'm not saying necessarily it's going to. I'm not making any predictions of when and how exactly. But it's a very basic change to the way that we do business and the way that we build networks and systems. And so that's why I think it's interesting and worth thinking about the applications, even if we get away from the expectation that everything's going to change tomorrow. And the reason that I think it's such a basic change is that what's important is not ultimately Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies as a new investment vehicle or as a new form of money, or any of these particular implementations today. What's important is really something much deeper. It's about trust. And this is not just me talking. If you go back to the original Bitcoin white paper, released by some person or persons going by the name of Satoshi Nakamoto about 10.5 years ago on the cryptography mailing list, this is what Satoshi says that he or she or they were doing. That the idea was to create a system for transactions without relying on trust. Now that seems a little strange, right? Without relying on trust? Basically, the argument was that trust is the problem. The problem is that we need trust traditionally. And so the promise was cryptocurrencies and other blockchain systems can be trustless, that we can have transactions without having to have any reliance on anything trusted. And the contention that I'm making here and that I make in the book is, with all due respect to Satoshi, that's wrong. That's not actually what Bitcoin did. It's not actually what the blockchain does. It doesn't eliminate trust. I mean, how could it? Why would anyone find something like a cryptocurrency of any value at all without a level of trust? Yes, the technology enforces scarcity. It ensures that you can't easily double spend the same coin, but there are many, many things that are scarce and still of limited value. Value comes from people collectively believing that there's value, being willing to take something and use it for something of importance. So trust never fully goes away. And for some evidence of this, you might ask the customers of Quadriga CX. Quadriga CX is the largest cryptocurrency exchange in Canada, or at least it was earlier this year. About 100,000 customers, about $200 million on deposit for this exchange where you could buy and sell cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and Ether and so forth. And Quadriga announced earlier this year that its CEO, Gerald Cotton, had died while visiting India a couple months before. And then they said, well, we're very sorry. He had the only key. He had the cryptographic private key to all of the crypto on the exchange. They said, there's one cold wallet that has all of your money, and our CEO had the key. He's gone. We can't find it. That's an awful lot of trust, right? Think about it. If you went to a bank and they said, okay, we're going to take your money. Here, watch this. We'll put it in the vault here. We're going to close the vault, and the bank branch president has the key. And if she loses the key, we can't open the vault. You'd never put your money in a bank like that. That's way more trust than anyone would have in a traditional financial institution. And yet, users of Quadriga CX had that trust. Now, turns out the story is much crazier than that. People have done forensic analysis of Bitcoin and Ethereum blockchain. There actually is no cold wallet. The money was siphoned off over a period of several months, sent to various money laundering sites and other ways to obscure the trail of it. This was a Ponzi scheme, basically, that was essentially taking people's money. And yet, the point is, people were willing to use that exchange to hold their assets. Now, Quadriga is an exchange. It's not a blockchain itself. It works with the cryptocurrencies that are verified on the blockchain, but it's a centralized service. It takes custody of people's keys and manages them. But think about it. What's the population that would be the least likely to trust a centralized financial institution to control their money? It's crypto investors, right? These are people who are excited about, they're early adopters of this technology because it seems to be trustless, because they don't want to trust the banks and trust the government. And yet we know from studies that 80% of cryptocurrency users put their assets in a custodial exchange like a Quadriga CX. Now, most of them are much more legitimate, companies like Coinbase and Poloniex and so forth here, but people are willing, even if they are believers in the potential of this technology, to trust a custodial exchange. So what does that lead us to? What it leads us to is that blockchain is not the end of trust. Trust doesn't go away. It's a change in the structure of trust, what I call the architecture of trust. Because it turns out that there are different ways that trust manifests itself in the world. Trust is not an either or. It's not either you trust something or you don't. There are traditionally three forms of trust. The first one is peer-to-peer trust. So you have a trust in a person that you've done business with, maybe trust in a family member or a longtime friend. And companies can have peer-to-peer trust. Companies that have worked together for a period of time, have a relationship, will trust in each other. And that's why if your brother comes and asks you for a loan, you're probably not going to request a credit report before you give him the loan. I don't know all of your brothers, but generally, if you trust someone because you've got a relationship, you're willing to not just focus on the formalities of whether they can be trustworthy. Same is true among corporations. We see lots of examples where even though companies have contractual relationships that specify performance, the relationship matters. And the ongoing relationship matters, and so they allow the contract to be varied under some circumstances in the interest of the long-term relationship. So this is a very powerful form of trust, but it's limited. It's peer-to-peer. Doesn't scale very well to a large global impersonal economy. Second form of trust I call Leviathan in the book. This comes from Thomas Hobbes, 17th century English philosopher. And Hobbes' point was that we often enter into trusting relationships because there's a backstop, because we can use a legal form, a contract, to specify the terms of the relationship. And if someone breaches a contract, if I give my money to a company and they go run off with it, I can sue them. I can bring them into court. I can use the power of the legal system to enforce that agreement. And the legal system is an arm of the state, so I can actually use the government, which has the power to throw people in jail, among other things, to enforce my private agreement. And what that does is it actually facilitates trust in those private agreements. You hope you never will have to sue and go to court, but knowing that that's there as a backstop facilitates these private interactions. Problem there, of course, is you have to trust the government. And you have to go through the legal system. Now, I'm a lawyer, so I think laws are great. But even I can admit that the legal system is slow, it's inefficient, it often gets things wrong. So that's the limit of that form of trust. Third form of trust is intermediary. Instead of having to trust each other directly, we trust some central actor, some sort of institution in the middle of the network. And this could be a bank or an exchange, or it could be a large digital platform that provides a great deal of value. And the trouble with that form of trust, of course, is there's that intermediary in the middle, which has to be trusted and gains power by virtue of being in that point in the network. So all these forms of trust still exist today, are still relevant and important, but they all have this limit that there's something that has to be trusted. So blockchain is a fourth architecture of trust. It's a new structure for how trust manifests itself. And what blockchain trust says is that you can trust something very specific. You can trust the history of transactions, basically the state of the ledger, without having to trust any particular actor to verify that information. You don't have to trust a bank, you don't have to trust a government to issue a currency, you don't have to trust some validator that's saying, yes, this is accurate. You can trust the state of information, the cryptographically signed audit log, without trusting anything in particular. And this works through a variety of different technical mechanisms known as consensus. Bitcoin used a particular one called proof of work. But there are a number of other variants that make different kinds of trade-offs here that all have the feature that they allow a level of confidence that everyone has their own copy of information. But you can be confident that everyone is seeing the same thing. You're not copying from some central master, but you can believe and verify based on the underlying math and cryptography that what you are seeing is the same as what everyone else is seeing. So you can trust that information without a central point of trust. An important element of that is it involves immutability. So it is very difficult and ideally impossible to change the ledger. It's a write-only database. Because if anyone had the power to reverse transactions, if there were anyone who could say, that transaction happened, but now I'm going to send it back. Maybe it was a mistake, maybe there's some problem with the transaction. We all agree, let's send it back. If anyone had that power, you'd have to trust them, right? You'd always have to believe that no one used the power to reverse a transaction. So in order to trust that what you see on the ledger is accurate, without having to trust anyone in particular, you have to believe that those transactions are immutable. All right, so that's basically the essence of what blockchain trust is. What's it good for? Why would you ever need a blockchain? And so for this, we can ask an illustrious Googler, Vint Cerf. Vint put up this great tweet last year with a really simple flowchart saying, here's how you decide if you need a blockchain. Look at the flowchart. Do I need a blockchain? No. And Vint's right. There is nothing that you cannot do with a traditional database that you can do with a blockchain. It's just another kind of a database. So there's never a situation where blockchain is the only mechanism to do a certain kind of function. Now, there might be certain things you want to do that require certain conditions that blockchain is necessary for. But basically, for the application, you never actually need a blockchain. Now, fortunately, Vint actually said some nice things about my book, so lest you think that you should get up now and not be interested in this. My point is, even though we can agree that blockchain is not a solution to every problem and not necessary, there are still many contexts where it actually adds value, where even though you don't absolutely need a blockchain, you may want to use one. Two basic categories there. One is situations where there's too much trust. Now, again, not that trust gets eliminated, but trust can be minimized. And part of that is simply for security reasons. Anytime there is a trusted entity, it's a point of vulnerability. It's a single point of failure. So even if the entity is trustworthy, there are security reasons why you may want to use this approach. But then there are many situations where the concern is that the trusted agent is not going to be trustworthy. That's some of the examples that I've given you already, where we may want to have a system where we don't have essentially a monopolist in the middle of the network. If you are a central hub of trust, you have a set of incentives to maintain your control over the network as opposed to doing what's necessarily in the interest of everyone on that network. And finally, when you have these central islands of trust, there's not one trusted entity for the whole world. So what winds up happening is that where there are these central points of trust, many applications require many of them. So think about sending money around the world. Even inside a company, if you're a multinational corporation, you've got money in your treasury in Kenya and you want to send it to your affiliate in Canada. You can't just do that directly because there are multiple central points of trust involved. You've got to go through central intermediaries, through correspondent banks, through intermediaries that create liquidity across the currency pair. So you wind up having delays and costs, again, even if you're just moving money internally across borders. So that friction that comes up from the intermediation that trust requires is something that potentially we can overcome by using one shared blockchain ledger. Second category is sometimes there's not enough trust. So pretty much any time multiple companies have to work together, which is, of course, almost any kind of business transaction you can think of, there's a potential gap in trust. So you've got a buyer and a seller, even in a simple one-to-one situation, they are each going to want to keep their own set of records. And when you multiply that out across, let's say, a supply chain, and you've got a manufacturer that wants to ship products around the world, they have their own records, they contract with a freight forwarder, has their own set of records, they put something on a truck, there's a trucking company, there's a port, there's clearing customs, there's a shipper, and the whole thing repeats on the other end. And if something goes wrong, the products don't get to where they belong, then there has to be a reconciliation project, a process by which all the parties say, well, my records say I put it on the boat, but my records say it didn't get there, what happened? And this leads to tremendous fragmentation because sometimes there are errors. Sometimes there are problems in this process. So we get a tremendous amount of inefficiency multiplied by all the transactions that happen in the world because we have all these multiple islands and they don't connect up. And some things simply don't happen. Sometimes companies may want to work together, but they don't trust each other and they're not willing to give up control to one central intermediary platform, so the activity simply doesn't happen. The idea with blockchain is a shared source of truth. The idea is once the information gets on the blockchain, then everyone can trust in the information that they're seeing, and it potentially eliminates all of this massive duplication. It also means that the state, again, is just reflected on the blockchain. So instead of having to have auditors come in and pull data from all these different points and reconcile them, you can directly audit the blockchain itself. Or potentially regulators can come in and use the blockchain itself as the canonical source of information. And finally, once we get to these shared platforms, this again becomes the new base layer. This becomes the new connectivity layer. It's a decentralized platform that then can be the foundation for decentralized applications. And so this is the vision of these so-called smart contract platforms like Ethereum and many of the other blockchains coming after, the opportunity to actually create a decentralized computer using the blockchain technology and have application functionality and other higher level functionality written on top of it. So that's the potential. That's what's good about this. What's not to like? What's to worry about? Well, a great deal. Because again, the fact that you can trust the blockchain itself, trust the ledger, doesn't mean you can trust the whole system. And in fact, we see all of these cases where this technology gets abused or used for very problematic, untrustworthy things. Still today, one of the, if not the biggest use of cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin for actual transactions is people who want to do illegal things. Money laundering, illegal drug transactions, terrorist financing, and so forth. The New York Times recently collected some data with an analytics firm showing that those kinds of dark market activities are still a huge percentage of what people are doing with cryptocurrencies because the money that we have works pretty well and is already pretty digital for doing basic kinds of transactions. It's the people who want to avoid the accountability of that system who are some of the earliest adopters of this technology. And then you have situations like the Quadriga situation, where the basic transaction is a legitimate one, but you can't trust the people on the other end. We saw this with ICOs, initial coin offerings, raised $20 billion in about a year and a half in 2017-18. Huge percentage were just out-and-out scams. Now again, the blockchain, the cryptocurrencies were valid in the sense that you were accurately getting a cryptocurrency token that represented some share of the available tokens on that prospective application. But that didn't show at all that the person selling you those tokens was not going to basically run away and take all the money. Wall Street Journal did an analysis where they looked at major initial coin offerings. 20% of them were obvious fraud. Literally, you read the white paper, it was clear this was a scam. And yet, these things raised billions of dollars. So this is a huge problem. Again, the fact that the blockchain is trustworthy doesn't necessarily mean that the system is. And it's not just true of the open public blockchains like Bitcoin and Ethereum. There's a whole other world of what are called permission blockchains being used by enterprises, where the system is decentralized, but you have to get permission to access the network. Not anyone on Earth can join the network, which makes the consensus process a lot simpler. And you would think, okay, well there we don't have any of these problems of trust. Well, it turns out that we do. PwC did a survey several months ago of 600 executives around the world involved with blockchain projects, and they asked them, what's standing in the way of adoption? Well, you see here, one of the most significant, people don't trust each other. People don't trust each other? Well, I thought the blockchain was about getting rid of trust. Well, no, it's people don't trust each other. Again, you might be confident in the ledger, but how do you trust the other participants in the network? What are some of the other things that they said? Well, the number one was regulatory uncertainty. Law, the legal system, is something that people want to believe in standing behind these systems. And the next two, the other significant ones, were basically about governance, about how the blockchain networks are constituted, how they are formed, how they work together and interoperate with other networks. These are the elements standing in the way of realizing the potential of this technology. So in my book, I talk about this on two levels. First of all, I talk about what I call Vlad's conundrum. Vlad Zamfir is one of the key developers of Ethereum. And he points out that there seems to be this tension, that if we use blockchain and these immutable smart contracts for transactions, it seems to make it impossible to use law. Because if we have a transaction that is recorded immutably, sending money to a terrorist group, the fact that a government comes in and says, you can't do that, that violates our sanctions, seems to be immaterial because the transaction has already happened and no one has the power to reverse it. Similarly, you can create a decentralized application that is a decentralized prediction market, a place where you can buy and sell belief in predictions about future outcomes. And this is actually something widely used and studied in companies. People use it to predict outcomes of elections and so forth. You get skin in the game. The prediction market produces valuable kinds of outputs in a kind of wisdom of crowds sense. But the problem is running a real money prediction market is illegal today, or at least is very strictly regulated, because essentially it's a commodities exchange. It's really no different from the regulated futures exchanges that are available to investors. And it creates an opportunity to do things like create a prediction market on whether the President of the United States will still be alive in a year. And that may be intended as something totally legitimate, but it's functionally identical to an assassination market on the life of the president. So what do you do to stop that? Well, the idea is, well, it's immutable, nothing can stop it. So Vlad's argument was, I guess we have to choose. Either we have law or we have blockchain. And that doesn't sound terribly satisfying. There's a similar problem with regard to governance. I call this Vlads Paradox. Leviathan is an economic sociologist at the Oxford Internet Institute. He wrote about something called the Dow Incident. The Dow was a decentralized crowdfunding application built in 2016 on the Ethereum blockchain. It's like a Kickstarter or an Indiegogo, but totally created as a decentralized application. You provided Ether cryptocurrency, you got back tokens, you could vote those tokens for projects, the application provided a count, and the ones that got above a certain threshold would get the tokens to be able to use the cryptocurrency for building their application or their project, and then when they hit the milestones, they would contribute money back, which would then go back to the people who voted. And the problem was this exploded in popularity. raised $150 million worth of Ether in about 3 weeks in 2016, which at the time was a very significant percentage of all of the cryptocurrency outstanding. And then very quickly, someone found a bug in the code. They were able to exploit a fairly simple programming error, siphon off about 40%, about $60 million to their own account. This was clearly a theft. This was someone stealing people's money, and yet it was an immutable transaction. The smart contract didn't know the difference. The blockchain itself, the application code said, oh, yeah, this was a legitimate transaction, so there was no way to say, give the money back. So what had to happen was the whole community, not just the people involved in the DAO, but the whole Ethereum community, the miners, the coders, had to get together and decide what to do. Because this would have undermined trust in the whole blockchain. The fact that all this money got stolen so quickly would have probably killed off Ethereum. So ultimately, through this very kind of confused process, the Ethereum Foundation agreed to do a software upgrade. They got enough of the miners that were validating the blockchain to run the software upgrade to fork Ethereum. Not just to blow up the DAO, but to actually break the entire blockchain into two cryptocurrencies. One is called Ethereum, one became called Ethereum Classic. And the idea was the new Ethereum would reverse the hack. Money would go back, and then it would go forward, and the hope was the second chain would just die off. Didn't die off. Some people they believed so much in immutability, they picked up and started mining that chain, so that's still there as Ethereum Classic. Worth a lot less than Ethereum, but still out there. So this is the backstory, and Vili's point is this was governance. There was a problem. There was an unexpected challenge that someone was able to steal all of this cryptocurrency, and the community came together and made a decision. We're going to do this fork. And he says, that's great, but it's centralized governance. It's no different from saying the executives of a company or the large holders of cryptocurrency, the powerful leaders of the community made a decision. So what he says is, well, there's nothing new here. If you have governance, you don't have this decentralized blockchain technology, and if you have something truly decentralized, there's no governance. So these are really the same problem, the legal and the governance problem. And the answer to both is the same. It's not either or. Just as I said, trust is not either you have something that's trusted or not. Decentralization is the same way. Decentralization is a parameter. You can have systems that are more or less decentralized along various axes. And there's value in making things decentralized, but there's a trade-off there. And the reality is that systems that strive for widespread adoption, systems that want to reach the mainstream, want to be easy to use and convenient, are going to have to trade off some element of decentralization. It's just inherently harder to build systems that operate like today's massive centralized systems if you decentralized everything. And that's the reality of what actually has been built. And it turns out that it's possible in most cases to find hooks for legal enforcement and mechanisms for governance. So we've seen even applications and exchanges that are built to be decentralized, ones that are not custodial like Quadriga, that are basically just an application. It turns out typically there's a developer behind it. There's some centralized element of this network, and it's possible for legal enforcement to happen. So this is what we've seen with Shapeshift, which is a decentralized system that basically didn't require any identity. You could go put in your Ether and convert it to Bitcoin without having to identify yourself. They had some conversations apparently with law enforcement that said, we care about money laundering. Banks need to ask who you are. They need to understand the source of your funds. They have to check to make sure you're not sending it off to some terrorist group or sanctioned state. And you need to do that too. Because you're handling money. It's the same problem. And even these decentralized systems are generally gradually coming into compliance. Now, it's a long process. It's imperfect. But it turns out that even though you can build something that is theoretically totally decentralized, it doesn't get used as much. We see this similarly with privacy-protecting coins. There are technologies like Zcash and Monero and Grin that are designed to be harder to track than Bitcoin. And yet, you would think that that's what all the criminals would use. It's not what the criminals are using. Criminals just use Bitcoin. Why? Much more liquidity, much easier to get, much easier to use, much easier to spend. So even though there is some degree of arms race here, it's not that everything automatically moves to the hardest to track option. And so we're starting to see evidence of ways to leverage the value of the decentralized technology while also being legally compliant. Blockstack is a company that's building a decentralized platform, really a new internet, a whole framework of layers for decentralized applications. They are doing what's called a Regulation A+ token offering. They're doing something like an ICO, but legally compliant, using a framework in the US that was created for equity crowdfunding systems. So getting the benefit of being able to offer cryptocurrency tokens, the kind of liquidity that that gives you, while still fitting into the existing system. Again, this is taking time, it's imperfect, but we can see a pathway for this to happen. There is also a role for technology, though. And this is really the answer to Vili's point that you can't do something that really is governed and still be decentralized. The same kinds of mechanisms that can be used for consensus on the blockchain network can be used for governance. So it's possible, and there are systems like Tezos and Decred that are setting up decentralized voting systems where you vote your cryptocurrency in a situation like the Dow attack. If the community agrees that the blockchain should be edited to reverse a transaction, if enough people vote and agree on that, it's the consensus of the community, that can be automatically implemented. There are systems that also create hybrids between legal enforcement and the technology of smart contracts. So a Ricardian contract is something that basically says it's a human-written legal contract, specifies the terms of the parties, and there's a code-based, software-based smart contract that exists as well. And they're tied together. There's a hash of the human contract in the blockchain, so we can verify that's the correct human contract to deal with situations where there's not specified outcomes. And the human contract says the smart contract that controls is here at this address in the blockchain. So anything that can be done through the smart contract system gets done that way. And if there's a problem, it can be kicked out to the contract or even to a decentralized arbitration system based on the cryptographic keys using what's called multi-sig technology to be able to decide through either centralized arbitrators or even through a decentralized incentive-based kind of computational jury system. So there's a whole bunch of these systems being developed, again, still fairly early. Still at the prototype stage or at the early implementation stage, but they have a lot of promise, just as we've been able to see that the blockchain network itself, based on the cryptocurrencies, can remain secure for a long period of time. It's possible to think about these systems ultimately addressing these governance challenges. Ultimately, the reality is that these are systems that need governance, because that's what they do. Right? What makes a blockchain trusted is there's a sense of legitimacy. It's not just that you can go in and look at the code and you can be confident in the level of security in the cryptography. Again, it's like why people would use any cryptocurrencies, because they're willing to trust it. And consensus in the blockchain sense is not necessarily the same as a majority vote. You can have a majority vote and not have consensus. You can have a 95-5 vote and not have consensus because the 5% are not willing to agree. Consensus means after that process happens, everyone thinks it's legitimate. Everyone is willing to basically go along with the result of the majority. And that requires a variety of different mechanisms. So we have these different levers. We have the lever of legal enforcement. We have the lever of cryptography to make things certain about what their outcomes are and not easy to reverse. We have the lever of economic incentives, self-interest, game theory, to be able to push people to behave in a certain way without necessarily forcing them to, but in a situation, most people will not take the action that's economically destructive to them. And we have the lever of trust. Trust is still relevant here and is something that emerges from activities of systems where people are confident sufficiently in what's going on. Because ultimately, these are still human systems. The blockchain uses a lot of technology, but the technology alone is not what makes it successful. It's the confluence of the technology with communities, with values, with processes, and with a history of people seeing that this works and it achieves the goals that they have. And that relates to the very nature of trust. Trust is not just confidence. I can hold a gun to your head and be very, very confident you're going to do what I say. Doesn't mean I trust you, right? It's the opposite of trust. It's only because I don't trust you that I want to take those extraordinary measures. Trust requires a fusion of confidence with some measure of vulnerability. But people are willing to take a leap of faith. People are willing to trust and do something even if they are not certain. That's what trust means, and it's possible to get there with this technology. but only by coming up with systems that use human mechanisms for what they're good for and use the technology for what it's good for. So we are still fairly early in this process. I am very excited about the technology and its potential. There are some early low-hanging fruit examples. The ones that are going to be maturing faster and adopted faster are the ones that are more incremental. If you want to use a cryptocurrency for a traditional financial trading application, once you're sure that it's a repository of value, that it works like money, you can take it to Wall Street, they'll securitize it and make it tradable. They know how to do that. That's not revolutionary. It's valuable, it's useful. The things that are revolutionary are going to take longer. The fact that we had this huge upsurge in price of cryptocurrencies, I think, tricked people into thinking we're further along. But the endpoint is still there. The potential is still there. And we're at a point now where many, many organizations are looking at how this can be useful. Ultimately, as with anything else, it's about fitting the technology and the application to the need and to the problem it's trying to solve. So that's where we are today. We are exploring the map. There are many different solutions here, for example, trading off some measure of decentralization for some measure of performance or some other value. There's not one right answer. But what needs to happen is experimentation and implementation to find the solutions that solve the real world problems. That's the point that we're at today. I'm excited about where this could go because there's so many situations where either the gaps in trust or problems with untrustworthy entities are so significant that this is really a technology that we need at some point. So thanks very much. Would love to take your questions.
In your experience on constructing this book, how do you feel the digital asset market will evolve over the next decade or so?
Well, part of it is it depends what you mean by the digital asset market. So I think that really the market of people that are treating these as financial assets, that are saying, again, this is a different kind of money, and just as we can trade stocks and bonds and any other kind of synthetic financial asset, this is a new asset class. I think that's a real thing. And I think that's going to evolve fairly quickly because it just has certain benefits. If you have something that's truly digital at a native level, and it's inherently liquid in a way that traditional financial assets aren't, you can have a lot more volume and something that's much more global than traditional assets. So I think in the near term, you're going to see traditional Wall Street players saying, okay, we know what to do with this, and building new kinds of derivatives and new kinds of financial products based on it. I think the potential, though, is really going beyond that. And so I think the next stage will be, for example, using this for global financial transactions, for financial inclusion. There are 1 billion people in the world or more that are unbanked. And it's not a trivial solution to use a cryptocurrency for that, but I think there is potential there if you build out the systems on the ground. So I think that'll be the next stage, is seeing this used for different things. But there are so many financial products today and so many assets that could be tokenized. Any physical asset, like real estate, in theory, could be turned into interest in cryptocurrency tokens that could then be recombined in new ways. So I think we'll see a steady stream once we get over the initial regulatory hump. And that's really what's happening over the next couple of years here in other jurisdictions, saying how do we create, for example, a regulated exchange where you can avoid the kind of Quadriga CX problem and know that if the one running the exchange is basically running a Ponzi scheme, that they can be stopped or have to provide redress. Once we get over that hump, then I think we're going to see a great deal of adoption.
There are obviously many public policy implications of this whole suite of technologies, but even going back to the earliest days of blockchain, one public policy implication that never occurred to me as a mathematician and so on was the environmental impact of some of the proof-of-stake systems. What are the most interesting insights you've learned from talking to state stakeholders, and what's your best way of communicating what you think are, does it worry you, or how do you react to that?
Yeah, so environmental impact is a huge concern, and I didn't really talk about it, but the proof-of-work system in Bitcoin requires huge amounts of wasted computation, huge amounts of energy usage. By some estimates, cryptocurrencies use as much energy as a small European country today. And in an age of climate change, obviously, that's a huge concern. There are many other concerns about that proof-of-work mining system, its potential for capture by certain actors and so forth. So my sense is we're going to have to get beyond that mechanism. Because the energy usage isn't the point. The point is to make it somehow costly in order to essentially compete in this lottery to be the one verifying the next block of transactions. And there's no inherent reason why we need to use solving these hashing puzzles as the way of making something costly. The problem is the alternate mechanisms, which are basically these game theoretic mechanisms. You stake your currency and you're at risk of losing it, which in theory is the same thing. There's all sorts of problems and ways that can be exploited. But none of them seem to be fundamental showstoppers. And so I tend to think as this gets more mature, the fact that there are all these problems with the mining process, it uses so much energy, I think is going to increasingly be a drag. There's an opportunity to make money and do interesting things to optimize it in the near term. But we're already starting to see this. We're seeing China, which is the source of most of the mining activity. Chinese cities are starting to cut off the cheap electricity they're giving to these miners. Because initially they were saying, oh great, it's economic activity, it's technology based in China. Now they're saying, wait a minute, why are we giving away all this electricity to people who are just using it to burn up for something unproductive? So I think we're going to see that kind of pushback over time.
Well, I mean, I would consider that the gap between proof of work and proof of stake is indeed exactly this architecture of trust problem, because the thing about energy consumption, it's almost like a Theodore Veblen sort of conspicuous consumption thing where the waste is the point. Because it's one of the few things you can remotely validate that the other person did, like shoot yourself in the foot and give me a pound of flesh or a pile of gold or a pile of blood. The blood I can verify. In this case, the energy or the heat death of the universe you've accelerated. But substituting that for a piece of stake invariably involves now many, many more forms of computation. So I worry that some of the things that are most elegant about the math that get people excited about it are indeed on the proof of work side, and that people have to realize that proof of stake is not just a different blockchain, it's all the math you've talked about here is something where you're thinking you're kind of trust. That's where the trust seeps in.
So, in some ways, Bitcoin is perfect in that it works, right? There were many, many other previous attempts to do digital currency and so forth, and this was the one that took off because it's this elegant fusion of different things. And the proof of work actually is successful to keep this blockchain secure for all this period of time. The problem is it's perfect for a very limited set of applications. So again, what is a situation where you're willing to trade off all of those energy costs and other problems with that system? There are some. My guess is they're relatively limited. And that most of the activities, even just the basic transactional activities, and we're already starting to see this, where it's impossible to scale Bitcoin to what you need for retail transactions. And that's part of the system, that it does all this massive duplication and waste. But if you want to use it for transactions, so now they're building systems like Lightning Network, these second layer systems, but that trades off against some of the decentralization of Bitcoin. So my sense is I don't think Bitcoin's going away. I've called it a cockroach in a positive sense. It works for what it does. And I think there are some things for which that may be the best solution. But I suspect that the costs are such that you're absolutely right. It's going to be harder and take more time and more things to overcome to translate out of what is successful for proof of work. But I just think if we are going to see, and look, I'm not a perfect predictor of the future. I think it's possible that will prove to be a much harder hump to overcome. But then I think that will constrain the adoption level of these cryptocurrencies.
In a different vein, I was saying, talking to policymakers who've had several years of kind of bit-splaining going on. What are your favorite useful and more probably amusingly favorite useless analogies you've seen to history of trying to explain this in non-technical ways? Like, what do you think will be dominant paradigms that policymakers bring to it?
Yeah, so you can't generalize across policymakers. And just as an editorial comment, I hear so many people saying, well, the regulators don't get it, they're inherently slow, and they're just a drag on this. And the reality is, for one thing, you want regulators to be slow. You don't want a regulator that's going to say, great, I get it, I'm going to do something now based on some presentation that someone gave me for half an hour. You want them to think about what is going to be real here, what's going to endure, what are the real problems, and then how do we match that up with what we're trying to do. And no regulator or policymaker wants to stop innovation. I mean, I worked at the FCC. There was no one who went into that building thinking, how can I prevent the internet from helping people? No, they were thinking, how do I protect people? How do I deal with problems? How do I promote competition? How do I protect people's assets and intellectual property? And the consequence of that may have been negative, but that's what policymakers want. And so policymakers want to understand, how do we facilitate innovation while protecting what we need to protect? And I don't think there's any perfect analogy. What I find in talking to policymakers, and I work with a lot of them, is, again, you have to get beyond the hype and the people who, for whatever they say, are just like, woohoo, we're going to get rich. And the people who say, and policymakers are evil, and we will measure success by the extent to which we can do something that circumvents the government. There are people out there who say that, and I think that's terribly counterproductive. Once you get beyond that and you say, well, no, look, here's a real world use case. Here's a situation. I like talking about there's people building decentralized insurance products. They're going to Sri Lanka, where only 11,000 of 800,000 farmers have crop insurance. So all the rest are at risk of being totally wiped out. And the problem isn't that there aren't insurance companies, and it's not that none of the farmers have capital. It's that there's all these trust gaps getting from the farmer to someone who's going to sell them a policy. They've got to trust that their money is actually going to get deposited in the right place. They've got to trust if there's not enough rain or too much rain, they're actually going to get paid out. You can do that in an application. You can do that with smart contracts in a way that's much more efficient. There's actually companies doing that, creating platforms to do that. So that's an example where, again, a policymaker can understand the value proposition, even if they don't buy that particular application. So again, that's why I talk about trust, because they understand that trust is something valuable, and they can relate to it.
So Facebook just made some announcements about blockchain at F8. So this is kind of interesting. It's like a centralized figure approaching a decentralized system. Wondering if you see like changes happening now with blockchain, the trust elements. You have a big player entering this market that historically hasn't had trust. So wondering how you think about those dynamics, and as you talk about international finance, or probably all the current cost of doing international transactions, it feels like that might be where Facebook is thinking about. So to the extent you can talk about where you think it's headed.
Yeah, so I don't know exactly what Facebook is doing, but we know the various reports about what they're doing. This gets to my point that trust and decentralization aren't either or. There are many large established players that are active using this technology. In fact, just about every major company in the world has some sort of experimental project through using this technology. And and Facebook reportedly is going to use this as basically kind of an internal payments loyalty point system, because it turns out that even within organizations there are these gaps in trust. And there are these sort of problems that you've got multiple sets of records when you've got multiple entities coming together. So I don't think that people look at that and say, oh my God, the whole point of this was to kill off the Facebooks of the world. Well, no, there was no point of this. This is a technology that has various kinds of uses, and it's going to get adopted by different players. So I think it's important not to be religious about it. What Facebook is going to do with it is very different from what someone's going to do creating a decentralized, if you want to create a decentralized social network on a blockchain, that would be a competitor to Facebook. And so I think it's a matter of appreciating if they can do what they want to do a little bit more efficiently, they're going to use the technology. If they can't, they're going to abandon it. But I think it's less novel and surprising than people want to make it out to be. It's just another example of a company that, and they looked around, they got interested in this, they staffed up a group, and they figured out, okay, here's an initial application that we think will solve a real problem that we have. I don't know if they'll succeed, but I don't think there's anything, really illegitimate about that.
Where is blockchain not being utilized that you feel was a missed opportunity?
It's a good question. So the short answer is whatever I say, there's probably an example where it is being utilized there. I think there are all categories where it is being utilized, but it's not being utilized everywhere. So for example, there are many government potential applications where governments engage in record keeping. So there's some implementations, for example, using blockchain for land title, for recording ownership of real estate. The real potential is basically using a blockchain type system for identity. So government grants you your birth certificate or social security number in the US. They basically provide this record of your identity, which is then the foundation for all the services that go on top of it, for lots of private activity as well. And that's a centralized set of records. And then we have all these privacy issues when your social security number gets out somewhere. that can be re-architected on a blockchain platform using what's called a self-sovereign identity approach, where the idea is you control your identity. You can have something that's recording information, and you can have queries where someone can make a query for something. Is this person over 18 because they want to buy cigarettes? Did this person graduate from the college that they put on their resume or not? There can be an actor that has that information and says yes, without actually having to transfer the information back and forth, to basically do what's called a verifiable claim without exposing the data itself to privacy concerns and without centralizing the data in one place. I think that's something huge that governments can do that will be a foundation both for a lot of social benefit as well as a lot of economic activity. There's some experimentation going on there. The standards for self-sovereign identity systems are still being developed. But I think that's probably the biggest opportunity that I think we're just starting to see it, but I think it really could be the most transformative. Great. Thanks so much for coming.